Okay, well, Andrew, everyone around the net seems to think nanothermite was used, and they are quite upset at the notion that you suggest otherwise. In fact, they feel as if it's intentional disinfo.
Absolutely. Um, this is quite interesting. It's a whole area of study in of itself in the way that this has been promulgated and taken up. And I make some quite bullish comments when I come to this for several reasons. The first one is that I was taken in by this thermite theory when it started to come onto the internet. So this is what I've actually written about in my free book, 9/11 Finding the Truth. This is one of the sort of themes in this book, and I present the evidence in this book for how this came about. Because the thermite theory first started to appear just after the NIST reports were published in 2005. About a month after these reports were published, a physicist from Brigham Young University suddenly appeared on the scene. His name was Dr. Stephen E. Jones, and he said that he thought that thermite had been used to help take the towers down, and he proposed that many of the steel girders in the towers were actually, cut through with thermite. And the evidence for this was basically twofold. Firstly, that there was molten metal found in the basements of the buildings following their destruction. And this story later essentially seemed to turn out to be false, or perhaps not false in every sense of the word, but evidence that he was using wasn't actually pertinent to what it actually was that people were seeing. I'll try and get to that later if we get time. But so Jones comes out with this thermite paper in sort of about September 2005. He says there are now 4 videos showing molten metal falling from the towers just before the destruction. But actually, when you see this molten metal coming out, there's actually very little of it. There's only, it only comes out of the tower for, I don't know, 30 seconds, something like that, if that. And we don't actually know whether this video is real. It could be real, and if it is real, we're not quite sure exactly what it's showing, but we're pretty sure it's not steel girders melting, because the molten material seems to be coming from the wrong place anyway. But I took this as being an honest appraisal of the evidence when he came out with this. When Stephen E. Jones came out with this thermite evidence, I thought he was being honest, basically. And I was invited to join this group called Scholars for 9/11 Truth. So he came out with this paper. I was actually one of the people that reviewed it, and I thought, him being a PhD of physics, he would know what he was talking about. So I didn't particularly, at that point, take issue with the science, and indeed not even the science, but the basic observations which were in this paper. So I supported this research at that time, and it was really only, I think, in the mid to late summer of 2006 when I started to become aware there were certain people who were pointing out fallacies in this thermite theory. And the main one, which I mentioned in one of the last videos we did, was Dr. Judy Wood. And she didn't really go into sort of heavy science, as it were. She just was asking the question, where did the towers go? And in essence, that really brings us to the single basic observation which completely refutes the idea that thermite could have played any significant part in the destruction of the towers. And I think I said this in the last video, but I'm going to say it again. The towers turned to dust. And if you look at what thermite does, it does not turn things to dust. So once these problems began to be pointed out with this research relating to thermite, then it started to morph. And Stephen E. Jones says, well, actually, it might have been thermate, which is a combination of thermite, and then you add in sulfur, which lowers the melting point of steel. So then, once it was pointed out that thermite couldn't have done it in its ordinary state, it changed to thermate, and then it changed to nanothermite, and then it changed to nanothermate, and then we had thermite analogues, and then we had active thermitic materials, which essentially is a meaningless term, because thermite is actually, as I mentioned in some of the comments, that if you go and look up the chemical formula for thermite, it's actually a combination of iron oxide and aluminium powder. And you mix these together, two simple materials, and then you put in a hot fuse, and it starts off a small reaction between a small amount of the iron oxide and the aluminium, and it's actually called a redox reaction, an oxidation reduction reaction, where the oxygen is transferred from the iron, which is of lower reactivity, to the aluminium, which is more reactive, and you get the product being molten iron. But we didn't see molten iron when the towers came down. We didn't see these hot volcanic type flames coming out of the towers as they were destroyed. No, we saw them turning to dust, and anyone could go and observe that. You just go and watch the videos again. How much fire and flame, etc., can you see as the towers actually coming down? So you don't really need any calculations or any real science as such. You just need observation and a knowledge of what the thermite reaction actually looks like, and you can go and put in, to YouTube, thermite experiment or thermite reaction, and you get 50 videos. The momentum for the thermite theory built up. And this group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth was formed, and they also talked about thermite being the causative agent, despite all the problems that I've described. And we had this paper published, which was the active thermitic materials discovered in the World Trade Center dust. So people thought, oh yes, we've got a peer-reviewed paper now. It's been published in a scientific journal. Well, actually, that's not technically correct, because the journal that this paper was published in, which was called the Bentham Open Chemical Journal, is not a recognized regular journal. It's what's called a vanity journal. And what that means is that you can write a scientific paper, and as long as it basically conforms to the standard of or the structure, I should say, of a paper, you pay them $800 and they will publish this paper in their journal. And there is a number of significant problems with that paper. Like, for example, it doesn't address why the towers turned to dust. It doesn't address why Hurricane Erin was closest to New York at 8 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't address how cars were affected over a quarter of a mile away, I think nearly half a mile away from the World Trade Center. How can these cars have been affected by a thermite reaction over a quarter of a mile away? How can thermite selectively affect materials? How can thermite leave paper unburned, which we saw in large quantity? If you've got this huge hot 2000 degrees centigrade thermite reaction leaving paper unburned, how's that going to work? It doesn't work. It doesn't fit the evidence. It doesn't fit the data at all. So this is what you come to when you study the evidence. And then there's another side to this story too, because in 2006 I began to discover a bit more about Stephen E. Jones, and you can go and Google him and the words heavy Watergate. So Jones is basically playing the same role in cold fusion as he is in 9/11 research. It's called limited hangout. In other words, he's giving you some of the truth. For example, in cold fusion, he's telling you that the cold fusion effect is real, but he's saying it's no use. With 9/11 research, he's saying, oh yes, it wasn't Al-Qaeda that destroyed the World Trade Center, but neither was it directed energy weapons technology. Neither was it anything to do with some type of low-energy nuclear reaction, which is exactly what the Hutchison effect creates. So I think that Steve Jones, who has connections to Los Alamos National Laboratories, which is where they developed the atomic bomb in the 1940s, I think he knows how the World Trade Center was destroyed. And I think the thermite theory was put forward to lead people down a blind alley, and they knew they could control it. They could control the groups that were talking about thermite, and that is still going on. Here we are, almost 10 years after 9/11 now. The thermite theory came out at the end of 2005. So we're 5 years on from that just about now. Almost 6 years on, in fact. and everyone, almost everyone, is still talking about thermite, and the comments on your previous video bear witness to that. So if you want to know the real story, folks, you're going to have to do even more research, because the thermite theory is a cover-up in of itself. You are being duped by this theory, as I was in 2006, but you can find the truth if you keep looking for it. Now, for those that want to have a more scientific explanation and look at some of the science, I have somebody who wrote to me called T. Mark Hightower, who I've corresponded with several times. I think if you go and look for his name, you'll find out who he works for. I won't say that in this video because I'm not sure if he wants me to, but I don't think he makes it a great secret. You'll be able to find it out. T. Mark Hightower is his name. And he's written a paper very recently, which he kindly sent to me, looking at the chemistry of the thermite reaction and how it doesn't explain the evidence. And guess what? He started to write this paper having read Dr. Judy Wood's book, Where Did the Towers Go? He wrote it within a couple of weeks of reading that, and he collaborated with a couple of people. And the title of his paper, Has Nanothermite Been Oversold to the 9/11 Truth Community? And in that paper, you will look at his research where he goes into whether nanothermite could actually be an explosive or an incendiary. He looks at some of the other papers that have been developed to test this, and you can see that he concludes that thermite doesn't explain the evidence. So if you want to look at that, you can look at it. If you want to ignore it, then you're not going to find the truth, folks. I'm sorry, but I've been hearing this for 5 years now, and whenever we post something about Hurricane Erin, somebody will come back mentioning thermite. It happens all the time. It's gone right through the truth community like a virus, and it's still ongoing today.
You certainly appear to have conviction and belief in what you say, but you're could be accused of deliberately disseminating disinfo.
Mm-hmm. And I have been accused of that. I've been accused of being an agent. I've been accused of being very slick. I've been accused of several things. But the point is, you have to look at the basic empirical evidence. Does thermite turn things to dust, or doesn't it? What can turn steel to dust? Some people even deny that the steel turned to dust. So if you deny that, then where do you go from there? I mean, so whether I'm putting out disinformation or not becomes irrelevant, because you can look at the evidence for yourselves. You can go to the NIST report. You can look at the pictures in the NIST report, these 10,000 pages of reports. You can see if you can explain what is shown in them. And that's exactly what Dr. Wood did. If I was putting out disinformation, why would I have been involved in a court case which attempted to sue some of the military-industrial complex contractors, such as Science Applications International Corporation, Applied Research Associates, and Boeing? Why would I have been involved in a court case to try and bring those people to account for covering up what happened? You don't really get that many disinformation people to setting up court cases. Also, Richard Gage and Steve Jones put together what's called a request for correction when they sent that to NIST. In other words, they challenged NIST. Now, in the first version of their request for correction, they didn't mention the word thermite at all. They didn't mention the phrase molten metal at all. Why would that be? They're so convinced, and they're going around the country doing world tours as they are now, that thermite is the cause. Why didn't they actually put that word in the first version of their paper to their request for correction to NIST? That's not disinformation. You can go and download the paper from NIST's site. You can download that paper from the Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice website. You can search for the word thermite in PDF Reader yourself and find that it's not there. The only place you'll find it is not as a separate word, but in the URL where he links to the paper. And in the appeal for that document, he lists some other thermite research, but it's not his own. The thermite research that's listed in the appeal for the RFC refers to some fire survey from 1996 about some arson research or something. So is that disinformation? Well, you have to go and check it for yourself, and then you'll know, won't you?
What I find strange is there's an assumption that this was a false flag event, that it almost goes without saying. We're stuck in the argument of, was it thermite or was it not, or directed energy weapons, but no one's it's just a funny assumption that the whole general population should accept that it was a false flag and that the whole thing is a lie that we're being told. I haven't really presented you with a question, but do you have a comment on that?
Well, if I may phrase your question for you, which is what I think it might be, is why does it matter? What does it matter that whether it was thermite, whether it was directed energy weapons, whether it was HAARP, whether it was gravity? Is that your question? Would that be kind of what you're saying, or?
That is an excellent question, so please use that.
Right. Well, the reason why it matters is it's to do with energy, because the events of 9/11 prove that free energy technology is real. It's not a theory. It's in the evidence. In the same way that we can prove that the moon goes round the earth and the earth goes round the sun through observation and measurement, we can prove that. You can prove through observation and measurement that the World Trade Center was destroyed using directed energy weapons. It is not a theory. So that proves that some group, whoever it is, we don't know who the group is, has an advanced weapon system, and it was used on 9/11, and that employs technology which we don't publicly have knowledge of. It's black technology. So people need to go and do research into black budget programs and see what they can find out, because there is some information that seems to be valid. So we now can not only say, for example, that 9/11 was an inside job, or 9/11 was a false flag event, or whichever way you care to describe it. We can also say, for example, that the energy situation that we're in is a scam. We don't need fossil fuels because that somebody has the technology to get energy out of the vacuum, and they've turned it into a weapon. So that's why it's important to realize that. If you just go with the thermite story, the reason why that was put out there was to cover up the energy issue and to steer them away from thinking about it, because not only is the false flag nature of 9/11 revealed as a for what it is, if you go down the directed energy weapons route and you get to the truth, which is what it is, you're then exposing the energy fraud that we've been subject to for the last 120 years or so. Go on from there. Look at the weather on 9/11. Look at what Hurricane Erin did and how its energy system was employed as part of this operation. What does that then reveal? Well, it reveals that the whole story of climate change is also a fraud, because somebody has the ability to manipulate the weather, at least in terms of steering hurricane storm systems. So the climate change scam is also exposed. So that, to me, if I was to give you a reason why is Dr. Judy's research attached, why is Dr. Wood's research attached so much, it's because not only does it expose 9/11 as an inside job, or whatever expression you care to use, it exposes the energy fraud, and it also exposes the climate change fraud as well. So that's why it's so very, very dangerous to have people understanding what is really going on.